What if the most important Neanderthal in human evolution has never been found? Not the old man from La Chapelle, not the woman from Gibraltar, not the eastern groups from Siberia, not the high-coverage genome from Altai, not the vindiger DNA from Croatia that helped rewrite the ancestry of living Europeans and Asians. What if the Neanderthal population that mattered most was the one still missing from the fossil record, the one that lived in the blurred contact zone between Arabia, the Levant, Anatolia, Zagros, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, where the maps of modern human and Neanderthal begin to break down? And this is where the story becomes dangerous for the clean replacement model, because the Neanderthal that mixed with the ancestors of later Eurasians was not a classic Western Neanderthal or an isolated Siberian Neanderthal. It was a ghost population, genetically closer to modern humans because of long contact, repeated admixture, shared ancestry, and deep overlap across the Middle East. And if that is true, then the famous number repeated in textbooks and documentaries, the claim that Eurasian-derived lineages are only 2 or 3% Neanderthal, does not mean what most people think it means. The standard story is simple, almost too simple. Modern humans evolved in Africa, expanded outward roughly 50 to 70,000 years ago, encountered Neanderthals somewhere in Western Eurasia, mixed with them briefly, picked up a small amount of Neanderthal ancestry, and then replaced them across Europe and Asia. In this version, Neanderthals are an archaic population. Modern humans are the main lineage, and the genetic contribution of Neanderthals is treated like a minor footnote, a small archaic residue sprinkled into an otherwise modern genome. The psychological power of this story depends on boundaries. Africa is where modernity begins. Eurasia is where archaic humans linger. Modern humans enter. Neanderthals seemingly vanish. The surviving genome is overwhelmingly sapiens, with only a trace of the defeated older population left behind. It is neat, memorable, and emotionally satisfying, because it gives human origins a clear direction and a victorious central character. But the genome is not a clean battlefield. It is a palimpsest, a manuscript written over older text, where some letters remain visible and others are absorbed into the background until they no longer look foreign. When geneticists estimate Neanderthal ancestry in living people, they are not opening the genome and reading a perfectly labelled archive. They are making comparisons. They look for segments in living people that resemble sequenced Neanderthal genomes more than they resemble reference modern human genomes. That method works best when the archaic ancestry is clearly divergent, when the Neanderthal donor is close to the Neanderthal genome being used as a reference, and when the receiving population is not already carrying similar ancestry or shared structure. But what happens if the real donor population was not like Altai? What happens if the Neanderthals who entered the ancestry of later humans were a southern ghost lineage that had already been exchanging genes with sapiens-related populations for tens or even hundreds of thousands of years? What happens if the DNA they contributed was not dramatically different from modern human DNA, because the populations had already been overlapping for a very long time? That is the key problem. The Neanderthal ancestry we can easily detect is only the portion that remains visibly different from the modern human baseline. The more divergent the segment, the easier it is to call Neanderthal. The more similar the segment, the more likely it is to disappear into the statistical background of normal human variation. If a southern Neanderthal lineage had already been partially sapienized, meaning it had already absorbed gene flow from sapiens-like populations or retained ancestral variation shared with them, then its contribution to later Eurasians would not look like a clean archaic block. Some of it would look unmistakably Neanderthal, some of it would look intermediate, and some of it might look modern enough that it would never be counted as Neanderthal at all. The result would be a systematic underestimate, not because geneticists are careless, but because the categories themselves are too crude for the biological reality. The image of a ghost introgressing Neanderthal makes this problem visible, as shown in this chart from a recently published study. On one side stands the sequenced Altai Neanderthal, often used as a reference point for identifying archaic ancestry. On another branch stands the introgressing Neanderthal, the lineage that actually contributed DNA to later humans. These are not necessarily the same population. In some models, the Altai Neanderthal and the introgressing Neanderthal lineage are separated by roughly 252,000 years of divergence. Vindija lies somewhere in the middle, meaning that the classic Western Neanderthals were not the main source of Neanderthals' genes. 250,000 years is not a small regional difference. It is a deep split within the Neanderthal world, long enough for populations to become substantially structured, long enough for repeated local admixture, long enough for some lineages to become more isolated and others to become more connected. If the Neanderthal reference genome comes from a deeply diverged Siberian lineage, but the actual donor lived much farther west or southwest, in the great contact belt of the Middle East and Central Asia, then the reference is not measuring the donor cleanly. It is measuring a relative of the donor from a different branch of the family. That distinction matters because Neanderthals were not a single uniform block. They were a widespread Eurasian population with regional lineages, demographic bottlenecks, replacements, expansions, and local histories. The Altai Neanderthal from Siberia represents one branch. Vindija from Croatia represents another, closer in some ways to the Neanderthal ancestry found in living people, but still not the exact source. Western European Neanderthals had their own history. Siberian Neanderthals had theirs. The southern ghost lineage, if it existed as the principal introgressing population, stood somewhere between classic Neanderthals and sapiens-related populations, not because taxonomy magically changed, but because geography made long-term contact possible. The Levant, Anatolia, the Zagros, Arabia, and the Iranian plateau were not sealed compartments. They were corridors, refugia, ecological thresholds, and meeting grounds. In warm phases, populations moved north and east. In cold or dry phases, they contracted into refuges. Across hundreds of thousands of years, the same regions could have repeatedly brought different human lineages into contact. This is where the replacement narrative begins to wobble. It assumes that modern humans and Neanderthals were cleanly separated until a late moment of contact, but southwest Eurasia does not fit that simplicity. The Levant alone preserves a long and confusing sequence of populations and fossils that resist easy classification. There are early Homo sapiens-like fossils often dated around the last interglacial and after, associated with behaviors that are difficult to dismiss as primitive. There are Neanderthal-associated remains at sites like Tabun, Kebara, and Amud, but some of these Levantine Neanderthals do not fit the harsh stereotype of Western European cold-adapted Neanderthals. Amud 1, for example, is tall, large-brained, and in some ways more gracile than the stock image of a squat Ice Age brute. The Levant looks less like a border wall between species and more like a long-term contact zone, a shifting human frontier where traits, technologies and genes could have passed repeatedly in both directions. Shanidar Cave has also been noted for their modern, tropical morphology, especially Shanidar II. If such a zone existed, then the ghost Neanderthal population that mixed with later humans already had been shaped by that contact. It carried Neanderthal ancestry, sapiens-like ancestry, older shared ancestry, and regional adaptations blended together over long periods. To call it simply Neanderthal may be technically convenient, but biologically incomplete. It was Neanderthal in the same way that later Upper Paleolithic Europeans were modern human, part of a population history, not a pure essence. It could have been a southern Neanderthal lineage that had already absorbed sapiens genes before the main expansion into Eurasia. Or it could have been a sapiens-related population that had already absorbed so much Neanderthal ancestry that the distinction becomes unstable. Either way, the clean categories begin to dissolve. This also changes how we think about genetic distance. When researchers say that Neanderthals and modern humans diverged hundreds of thousands of years ago, that does not necessarily mean every real population on the ground was separated by that full distance. A split date is a model of ancestry, not a wall in the landscape. Populations can diverge and then exchange genes. Branches can diverge and reconnect. A lineage can look ancient in one part of the genome and recent in another. If southern Neanderthals and sapiens-like populations overlapped for long periods, then the local divergence between them was far smaller than the divergence between Altai and a modern African reference, or between classic Western Neanderthals and later modern humans. The more contact there was in the Middle East, the more misleading it becomes to treat Neanderthals as a single distant population and sapiens as an invading population. This is why the unsequenced ghost matters so much. We have genomes from a limited number of Neanderthals, and those genomes come from specific places and times. They are extraordinary scientific treasures, but they are not the whole Neanderthal world. A high-coverage genome from Altai gives us one branch. Vindiger gives us another. Chagirskaya, Mesmaiskaya, and other remains help fill in the picture, but the geographic heart of the likely admixture zone remains underrepresented. The population that mattered most lived in regions where preservation is poor, fossils are rare, politics complicates excavation, or ancient DNA does not survive well. If the actual introgressing Neanderthal was a Middle Eastern or South Asian population, then we are reconstructing the most important part of the story from its cousins, not from the source itself. Imagine trying to estimate the ancestry of a mixed population using only a distant relative of one parent group. If the real parent group is close to the reference, the estimate is fairly accurate. But if the real parent group has its own mixture history and is closer to the other parent group than the reference is, the estimate becomes distorted. The ancestry that resembles the distant reference will be counted. The ancestry that does not resemble it enough is missed. The result will look like a small contribution from an archaic population, when in reality the contribution is larger but partly hidden by similarity. In the case of Neanderthals, this means the detectable 2 or 3% is only the sharp edge of a much broader inheritance. The rest is buried in shared human variation, ancestral polymorphism, or ancient admixture that our categories label as modern because it no longer stands out. This does not mean that every gene in modern Eurasians is secretly Neanderthal or that standard estimates are useless. It means the estimates are conditional. They measure what the method can detect under specific assumptions. They are strongest for divergent, archaic segments, and weaker for overlapping ancestry from an unsampled donor. The phrase Neanderthal DNA itself becomes slippery because it depends on what we mean. Do we mean DNA that resembles Altai or Vindiger more than modern humans? Do we mean DNA inherited from any population taxonomically called Neanderthal? Do we mean DNA from a southern Neanderthal population that was already hybrid? Or do we mean genetic material from the broader Neanderthal sapiens Métis population before the categories fully crystallized? Each definition produces a different answer, and the popular story usually hides this complexity behind a single percentage. Once this is understood, the replacement narrative starts to look less like a historical reconstruction and more like a simplifying myth. The old model imagines modern humans entering Eurasia and replacing Neanderthals. But an alternative scenario is possible. Modern humans entering the Middle East did not simply replace Neanderthals there. They were absorbed into an already sapienized Neanderthal population, or merged with a human population that already carried both Neanderthal and sapiens-related ancestry. This hybrid southern population then expanded outward, not as pure African Homo sapiens carrying a small Neanderthal souvenir, but as a fused population, a new evolutionary coalition, genetically and culturally equipped to move through northern Eurasia. In that scenario, the population that later expanded into Europe and Asia was not simply sapiens replacing Neanderthals. It was a hybrid frontier population replacing other Neanderthal lineages, especially the more isolated Western European and Altai-related branches. This would explain one of the strange tensions in the evidence. The Neanderthal ancestry in living humans does not appear to come directly from the most divergent Neanderthals we have sequenced. It points to a population closer to Vindiger than Altai, and possibly to an unsampled branch even closer to the actual source. Early modern humans in Eurasia sometimes carry recent Neanderthal ancestry, but they are not simply half Neanderthal in a visible anatomical sense. They are mosaics. Some individuals show recent admixture, others show older admixture, Some carry lineages that later vanish, others seem connected to later populations. The picture is not a single wave replacing a single archaic group. It looks more like a braided expansion, where hybrid populations formed in contact zones and then moved into territories occupied by other related but distinct human groups. The Middle East is the obvious place for such a process because it was not merely a passageway out of Africa, it was a long-term human theatre. During humid phases, Arabia and the Levant opened. During arid phases, populations contracted toward coasts, rivers, mountains and refugia. The Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf Basin, the Zagros foothills, and the Caucasus formed a web of ecological corridors and barriers. Over tens of thousands of years, different populations could meet repeatedly, diverge, and meet again. A sapiens-like population from northeast Africa might expand into the Levant, meet Neanderthal-related people, mix, retreat, and leave ancestry behind. Later, Neanderthal-related populations might move south or east and acquire more sapiens-like ancestry. Still later, a hybrid population might emerge from this zone with a genome that was neither purely African sapiens nor classic Neanderthal, but something more complicated. A contact population, a frontier population, a human blend produced by long-term overlap. This makes sense of the idea of an already sapienized Neanderthal population. The phrase sounds provocative, but biologically it simply means a Neanderthal lineage that had already received gene flow from sapiens-related populations and perhaps adopted or shared some cultural behaviors across the contact zone. This does not require a sudden transformation. It does not require a Neanderthal population becoming modern overnight. It only requires repeated contact, interbreeding and selection across enough time. The result would be a population that still carried Neanderthal morphology or ancestry, but also carried genes and perhaps behaviors associated with neighboring sapiens-like groups. When later populations expanded northward, they would have been descended from this mixture. They carried the demographic momentum, technological networks and genetic flexibility that allowed them to enter Europe, Siberia and beyond. In this scenario, Europe's classic Neanderthals were not replaced by pure sapiens. They were replaced, at least partly, by a hybrid population already carrying Neanderthal ancestry from the Middle East. That is a very different story. It means the end of Neanderthals was not simply a species extinction caused by modern humans. It was a lineage turnover within a broader human continuum, where one Neanderthal sapiens mixed population expanded at the expense of other Neanderthal populations that were more isolated, more regionally specialized, or demographically weaker. The conquerors of northern Eurasia would have been hybrids before they arrived. They replaced European and Altai Neanderthal lineages not because they were biologically pure moderns, but because they were a composite population formed in the very zone where the old species boundary was most porous. That interpretation also fits the broader archaeological problem. The spread of so-called modern behavior does not always look like a clean package suddenly carried out of Africa. Blade technologies, ornaments, pigments, burial practices, Levallois methods and regional tool traditions appear in complicated patterns across Africa, the Levant and Eurasia. Some behaviors appear early, disappear, reappear or spread unevenly. The Middle Paleolithic and early Upper Paleolithic are full of mosaics, not revolutions. If populations themselves were mosaics, this makes the archaeological record easier to understand. A hybrid population moving out of the Middle East could carry mixed traditions, mixed technologies, and mixed biological ancestry, interacting with local Neanderthal groups in Europe and Asia, not as a different species from another world, but as relatives who were different enough to be distinct, yet close enough to merge. This also helps explain why the search for a single cognitive difference has become so frustrating. If Neanderthals were simply a failed archaic species, then we should expect a clear biological reason for their disappearance. Inferior brains, inferior language, inferior planning, inferior symbolic thought. But every time researchers test these claims, the gap narrows. Neanderthal brains were large. Their brain organization may have differed, but not in a way that clearly proves inferiority. Their tools were effective. Their hunting was sophisticated. Their survival in glacial Eurasia was extraordinary. Their genes entered later humans. Their children with sapiens were fertile enough to leave ancestry in billions of people. The old idea that they disappeared because they were simply less intelligent now looks less like a conclusion and more like a narrative need. The replacement story required a reason for replacement, so inferiority filled the space. But if the real story was absorption, hybrid expansion and lineage turnover, then no great cognitive gulf is needed. Population dynamics are enough. A small isolated group can vanish when absorbed by a larger network. A regionally specialized lineage can be replaced by a hybrid population with broader connections. A classic European Neanderthal population can disappear without every Neanderthal gene disappearing. A Siberian Neanderthal lineage can go extinct while related ancestry survives through a different branch. In this model, extinction is not a clean death. It is a reorganization of ancestry. The visible Neanderthal form disappears, but parts of the Neanderthal world survive inside a new population that had already crossed the boundary between categories. The underestimation problem becomes central here. If we only count the Neanderthal DNA that is highly recognizable against Altai or Vindiger, then we are undercounting the contribution of the Middle Eastern ghost population. And if we undercount that contribution, we preserve the illusion that modern Eurasians are overwhelmingly descended from a pure sapiens expansion with only minor archaic input. But if much more of the genome comes from a sapienized Neanderthal or Neanderthal sapiens contact population, then the ancestry of modern Eurasians becomes far less clean. We would not be looking at modern humans with a tiny Neanderthal trace. We would be looking at descendants of a hybrid population whose Neanderthal-related ancestry has been partly hidden by similarity, recombination, selection, and the absence of the true donor genome. This also means we are overestimating the divergence of the southern Neanderthal population. If our main Neanderthal references are more distant, colder climate, regionally specialized lineages, then we project their divergence onto Neanderthals as a whole. Altai makes Neanderthals look more divergent from modern humans than the actual introgressing population was. Classic Western Neanderthals make the morphological gap look sharper than it was in the Levant or surrounding regions. The southern ghost lineage was closer, more mixed, more transitional, and more difficult to classify. If we had its genome, the boundary between Neanderthal and sapiens might look much less like a cliff and much more like a slope. That missing genome is the ghost at the center of the story. It is not a ghost because it was unreal. It is a ghost because we infer it from the traces it left in others. It appears in models, in mismatches between sequenced Neanderthals and introgressed ancestry, in the strange fact that the Neanderthal who mattered most is not the Neanderthal we know best. Somewhere across the Great Belt from the Levant to Central Asia, populations existed that carried the key mixture. Their bones may be lost, misclassified, undated, or still buried. Their DNA may be destroyed by heat, humidity, time, or geology. Yet their descendants carried their ancestry into Europe, Siberia, East Asia, Sahul, and eventually across much of the world. The most important Neanderthal population may have conquered history by vanishing into the population that replaced other Neanderthals. This would invert the usual narrative. Instead of Homo sapiens leaving Africa as a pure superior species and defeating Neanderthals, we might be looking at a Middle Eastern fusion event, or a long series of fusion events, in which sapiens-like populations were absorbed into a Neanderthal-related contact zone, producing a hybrid population with deep roots on both sides. That population then expanded north and east, encountering classic Neanderthal groups in Europe and Altai-related lineages in Siberia. Some were absorbed, some were replaced, some contributed more ancestry. Others vanished almost completely. The result was not the triumph of purity, but the triumph of mixture. And that may be why the old categories feel increasingly strained. Neanderthal and sapiens are useful labels, but they can become traps when we treat them as fixed biological nations. In the real Ice Age world, populations moved, met, merged, split, adapted and disappeared. The Middle East was not a customs checkpoint between species. It was a human melting zone operating across vast time. If the ghost Neanderthal there was already closer to modern humans then the genome of living Eurasians preserve a much deeper Neanderthal-related inheritance than the visible percentage admits. Not because the science is fake, and not because every estimate is wrong, but because the real donor was missing from the comparison. The question then is not whether Neanderthals contributed to us. That question has already been answered. The question is how much of that contribution we are capable of seeing, and how much has been hidden by the very assumptions used to define it. If we define modern humans as the baseline, then shared or overlapping ancestry disappears into the baseline. If we define Neanderthals using Altai and Vindhya, then a southern ghost lineage may be only partly visible. If we assume replacement first, then every ambiguous signal becomes a small exception to replacement, rather than evidence of a different process. The story survives by controlling the categories. But the fossils, the genomes, and the geography keep pushing back. The Middle East sits there like a contradiction on the map, too central to ignore and too complex to simplify. It is where African, European, and Asian populations could meet. It is where Neanderthal and Sapiens ranges overlapped. It is where a ghost population could have formed, not as a minor side branch, but as the ancestral engine of later Eurasian humanity. And until that population is found, sequenced, and understood, the confident language of replacement should be treated with caution. The missing Neanderthal is not a footnote, it may be the key. In the end, the most unsettling possibility is that modern Eurasians are not simply the descendants of Homo sapiens who picked up a little Neanderthal DNA on the way out of Africa. They are descended from a hybrid population born in the long overlap zone, a population in which sapiens were absorbed by already sapienized Neanderthals, such as those from Shanidar Cave, and in which Neanderthals were transformed by sapiens before either label could fully describe the result. That population would have been the one that moved into northern Eurasia, not as pure replacement, but as a blended human force that erased the older regional lineages by absorbing some and overwhelming others. If so, then the old story has been looking in the wrong direction. The mystery is not why modern humans replaced Neanderthals. The mystery is whether the humans who did the replacing were already, in a deeper and less visible sense, Neanderthal themselves, and whether anyone ever migrated out of tropical Africa into an Ice Age Eurasian world already occupied by cold-adapted, highly intelligent and deeply entrenched, sapienized Neanderthals. Neanderthals didn't go extinct. They didn't disappear. They assimilated. And with that statement, we leave you to ponder the mysteries of our shared human history. Until next time, stay curious and stay questioning. Also, please subscribe, share and explore our channel's other videos. Thank you and take care.